welcome to the Freethought Forum, show for Rationalist, co-sponsored by the Rationalist Tennessee, the Atheist Society of Knoxville. We're coming to you live on Wednesday, as we are every week typically. And if you are agnostics, atheists, free thinkers in general, you're not alone. Right here in East Tennessee, we have several places of local gatherings, spread throughout the week, spread throughout the month. One of them is my co-host. I'm Riv, by the way. This is really off the cusp.
I'm David. I'm actually a member of the Secular Student Alliance at Pellissippi, so here local.
Yeah, Pellissippi, Hardin Valley. And so we basically have a couple events coming up for the RET website, rationalist.org. We have the annual Day of Reason Cookout, which is, interestingly enough, on the same day of the annual day of prayer, isn't it? May 3rd also?
Yeah,
I found that interesting, the overlap there.
Yeah.
But we have that. It's at the Tyson Park Pavilion 1, that's in Knoxville. And then we have the first coming up, the first of the two bi-monthly events at the RIT, 10:30 to 12:30, in the Goins Cafeteria Annex on the Hardin Valley campus. And that's from Robert Reich, Preparing Our Economy for the Impact of Automation and AI, talks at Google. And so that'll be interesting. Looking forward to that. There's another event on the third Sunday. And the second Sunday, we have the Skeptics Book Club, which is at Books A Million in Knoxville. And basically, we'll get to some more sponsors, or later on they'll have a break, talk a bit more about things. We have our topic here. Where does evil come from? And we were talking a bit about that earlier. And earlier, leading off also, I was talking about a discussion on the board that I didn't get back to, which I meant to, was if we create value, right, in everything that we do, not just because there's some there's some moral arbiter that says this is valuable and this is not. You know, we create value by doing what we do, and it depends upon the culture. You know.
Absolutely. I mean, the idea of from the idea of evil, say, what I consider social norms versus what someone else would consider social norms. It's going to directly dictate that, like what I consider to be bad versus good. So, I mean, culturally, there's huge range. So to say, for me to say, well, where does it come from? I mean, that's where it comes from. It comes from your culture.
Right. There's something I remember was discussed where there seemed to be a lot of common things across humanity, and it's how they express them, which differ. But a lot of the core things, you want to have a minimal level of trust in your society. There's this notion of loyalty in the sense of being able to rely on people to have to maintain certain qualities that you've come to know them for, and you can trust them, so on and so on. And altruism, of course, comes to mind. Basic security, basic essentials, all these things you see throughout society, and they're just expressed in different ways.
Yeah.
And if someone would consider jumping up and down naked in the streets, would be considered differently maybe elsewhere around the country, around the globe, different cultures, different systems. So to call it how you judge it is all contingent upon where you live,
right?
And the what society is considered that's acceptable, that's whatever. And that, goes to an overarching branch, but then you get into ethics and morals and the grayness of it all.
Right.
But ultimately, do less harm seems good, and unnecessary harm, when to avoid that. We all suffer. It'd be nice to not suffer as much.
Right. I think part of when you say, you don't want to suffer and you don't want others to suffer, it could be also influenced by that sense of empathy.
Right. And hate to cut you off just a moment. We got a phone call come in. Right. Welcome, caller. Are you local? Can I have your name, and are you local?
I'm not local. This is Charles from Central.
Hello, Charles, our intrepid reporter.
And weather's finally improved.
Oh, that's good.
Even though we're going to have thunderstorms, I prefer the thunderstorms with good temperatures versus 11 before wind chill. And the man on the left of my screen is new. Perhaps he'd like to give us some background. I understand he's from the Secular Students Alliance. And,
So I've actually just recently joined the Secular Student Alliance. I've kind of been on my own with this sort of secularist mindset for a while. It's nice to be actually with the group, but I'm a study of biology, or just the living organism is my sort of thing.
Yeah, run circles around me in physics and evolution in general. It's not a hobby, but not to any extent. What did you have a thought about in terms of aside of what we might all maybe agree on, maybe why someone might think something is evil, but you go down the street and someone else doesn't call it evil, for instance?
well, one of the problems is in different religions, different things are evil. And over time, in each religion, some things that are evil become non-evil, and some things that are not evil become evil. One of the big cases in point in Christianity is that Christ Jesus specifically stated that usury is strictly forbidden. If we were a true Christian nation, how many banks would there be?
Wasn't there a thing about in the past, one of the things that the Jews could deal in interest, whereas in Christianity you couldn't?
That is correct, and that set them up for a lot of pain and effort, because a lot of people decided that, hey, that blood libel thing, and then, their ancestors condemning Christ to death, and we don't have to pay our debts.
Right.
And so they got in a lot of problems over that.
Yeah.
We have banks all over the place charging interest, usury, as it's known.
Right. And isn't interesting that as long as you make some kind of family-oriented bank, locally owned, family-oriented, 18% interest on all loans, but family-oriented. Isn't it interesting? It just slides right under, the fine print.
Yeah, kind of. And then there's that county clerk that committed adultery and now has several illegitimate children, which is expressly forbidden both in Judaic and Christian concepts. And yet, I didn't hear one member of the clergy of either the Protestants or the evangelicals, mainline Protestants or the evangelicals, come out and banger for it at all. Not one zap from anybody.
Yeah, it's it's kind of the ongoing phenomenon, right? With different figures, we'd be what you're talking about earlier. People we come to trust and really appreciate their advice and their words. But if they do something, we so easily we kind of slide it off as, oh well, it's otherwise they're a really good person, but we won't worry about this. I mean, it happens. We easily do it. But I would say it's problematic if it's coming from if you're drawing on a different source that not only explicitly forbids it, but also it's twisted around to where it's not a big deal, versus a lot of cases of special pleading essentially just bakes into everything.
Right, and speaking about adultery, I feel like there's a part in the Bible where it says if a woman becomes, if the man and woman aren't together anymore, but someone else comes along and is with that woman, it's still adultery, if I'm not mistaken. I feel like that's one of those things that kind of has changed over time, I'm assuming. It's like, I hate to reach for the easy arguments here, but I guess another one would be, slavery in the Bible, how it really wasn't evil at the time, but I think we've changed our mind about things like that. So
only in overt chattel slavery. For instance, a lot of people in prison now are being rented out to do cheap labor work. So instead of paying, the going rate of $8.15 or $12.15 or $7.15 for a specific job, you can get a contract with some of these prisons, and you'll have these guys doing it for $2.50 an hour. So it's they're sliding it under the slavery ban by saying, see, they're getting paid some money, like 1/5 or 1/10 of what they would be making on the outside.
That word, that movie quip comes to mind. Are not we generous, or something like that?
Yeah.
It feels like a really bad analogy to me, though, because, say I work for really cheap rather than, sitting in a cell, versus, like a biblical sense of slavery, like after 7 years you have to let only the males go, and say if you get a slave and he has a wife before he's a slave, when you let him go, the wife goes with him, and any children they have. But if you give him a wife...
But if he has a wife, when he gets a wife as a slave, his wife and kiddies have to stay with the owner.
Right.
And the man goes down before the village elders, I believe, and has a yawl pierced through his ear and tells his master, my master, I want to stay with you forever, or something like that.
Right, so if I was to compare the two, like if I was looking at the guy who was in prison and he's working for really cheap versus the scenario we've just described, I feel like it doesn't exactly line up for me, equivocally.
It's not equivalent, but it's debt peonage. We used to call them bond servants. So,
well, it's kind of changing the terms of what it seems like in such a situation. I'm not a legal scholar, but it seems like that's changing the terms of the agreement. You go in to serve your time, but then over time they create different ways to add more value, nearly asymmetrical value that wasn't there before, and that wasn't what the original sentence was. So it seems like we found a way to very cleverly and change the terms of service.
Okay, I'll let you go.
All right. Well, thanks, Charles. And
have a good one.
you too. Thanks. Okay. Charles regularly calls in. Good guy. You're talking about empathy, though, and that kind of. I was wondering if I could swing this in a direction, maybe. In terms of pain, right? We understand that pain is necessary for our survival.
Right.
But gratuitous pain and unnecessary pain would seem like something we want to avoid. But then, is it, in terms of, is it morally wrong or morally acceptable, for instance, to consider the suffering of, animals more so or less so than people, non-human animals, right? We were talking about this before.
Right, and we have had these really interesting conversations with the group there at the school, and so the idea that, and Richard Dawkins actually, he makes such a great point about this, that it's very likely that humans actually suffer less pain. Like, you have a dampened sense of pain because you have the cognitive capacity to say, you know what, that probably wasn't a good idea. I shouldn't do that in the future. Versus something that might not be able to put the forethought into saying, that's a bad idea. So that pain response has to be more intense to sort of convey the same message. So I think when you're referring to non-Homo sapiens and you're like talking about chimpanzees or livestock industry, for example, I mean, I think it should probably and I don't want to sound like anti-Homo sapien here, but they should probably weigh a little heavier, honestly, if you were just talking about pain. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very ignorant to the neural receptor aspect of sensation and the pain and how it would be increased in animals or non-human animals. But I think adding to that, if we keep animals around for our amusement / study / in whatever reason you could justify, because you have enough money to make the case and make it legal, as is often the case. They have that to deal with, and I'm thinking, because of our expanded abstract thinking, right? We can contrive all these scenarios, which may or may not have any correlation on reality, but they seem very real, especially if you're taught when you're young. And we have all that to contend with. I don't know,
It kind of it makes me think of that the conversation where we suffer from different things. Like we can suffer from regret about a decision made. We can suffer about anticipation for events to come.
Anxiety and
right. So I mean, it's like a trade-off. Maybe there's a little less pain, but there's also this other aspect that they might not get that we do. So.
Right. And pain perhaps being one aspect of it, right? And so if something explicitly says, let's say in the what is it? There's some other in Norse. I think there's a thing that Odin says, something along the lines of more of a guideline, I guess, in the Truoth, the Asatru. That kind of a guideline of at least according to the words, my limited understanding of what I read on it. The first accostation we met with clemency, the second with warning, and the last and final with blood. Right, it's kind of laying out a kind of system of how you conduct yourself.
Right.
And then you have other systems. You have biblical edicts, which run around themselves all the time. But even if you try to isolate them, you have something that says, okay, essentially from one source, you're saying, be patient, realize that these things happen. The second time, acknowledge they happen, but you put a warning out, you've been warned, and the third time, take action. Now, I'd say it goes a bit too far as a black and white, but it lays out something in what made sense at the time.
Right.
Whereas in that part of the world, in biblical edicts, you have things like, the caveats for slavery and how they can become your property. And if you're not Jewish, and if you're outside of the tribe, then it's just a bad day for you because you have no rights.
Right.
There's nothing. Women are property in the Bible. It's, that likes to be twisted a lot, but in so many ways it says that the husband will lord over them, and that they'll be subservient, and they shall be quiet, and basically not speak, not give their voices, and all these things.
And I think if we saw that in like a modern culture, maybe it would have to be something close to home. So say you saw that down the street. You saw someone behaving just as if they had learned everything they knew from the Bible. Like the way that they're supposed to behave, the way they're supposed to interact with others. We would probably look at it and be like, that's a really bad way of living your life. I mean, if we're going to talk about, evil and what it even means, I mean, perhaps we should kind of look at it from a defining point of view. Like, how would you even define evil?
I think, what's his name? He does a YouTube channel, TBS. Now I'm drawing a blank, and I think it was Scott something, but maybe it wasn't. Anyway, he did this thing called a treatise on morality. And essentially, it was a long half-hour clip. I enjoyed it. And one of the things that could be succinctly, at least words, summarized down to was, good is that which basically increases one's quality of life while attempting to diminish the inequality of shared joy, to try to reduce harm. I'm paraphrasing of some sort.
Right.
And the opposite would be one in which ways to actively harm others and reduce the quality of life, and otherwise bring about suffering or something like that.
Yeah, and that, at a glance, that really kind of makes sense to me. But then I wonder, like, how far it reaches out. Say, when I say others, I want to reduce the suffering for others. How far does my others extend? Am I talking about my family? Am I talking about the people who I identify that, the us versus them mentality? How far out does it go? And then does it stop at Homo sapiens? Do I extend it to other species? If I see, I'm in my village and a tiger attacks one of my cows and kills it, would I consider it evil? Is that an evil act? Probably not. I mean, I would be upset that if I lived in that community, I'd probably be upset that I lost a cow, to be honest with you.
Right.
But if the same tiger attacked a child, I mean, no one would hesitate to be like, that's terrible.
Right. We build up these systems where, it's like we're trying to constantly break our myopic and, echo chamber kind of perspectives, but we still have these instincts to kind of put priority on especially our family and friends and people we know and human beings in general. And I think a part of that is, basically passing along oxytocin, back and forth, and build up these bonds with each other. And the stronger that is, the stronger the pain we feel, or at least, especially whatever model we build up of that person, whether it's true or not. Our pain is, I think, correlated to how we feel about them. that affects how we feel about the moment. But with, like, when it comes to mind is, hypothetically, if a quark was supposed to spin left and it started spinning down instead, was it being a bad quark? I mean,
Right.
it's, when you scale it down to a point, it becomes, I think, more and more abstract of, are they even capable of experiencing what we might recognize as pain? And that's where I kind of like Sam Harris's kind of bit on it, of basically your capability to suffer is basically correlates with your rights, I guess. Your what you should have should have ability and access to is your ability to suffer. I might be mixing it up with consciousness.
Because I think with consciousness, it's sort of like is there a thing that it is to be like a book, or to be like a monkey, or to be like a snake? Is there a sense of being there? Is there a feeling that it is to be that thing?
Right.
I think that kind of goes along with that. But then, I mean, I guess you could with that you could take it and be like, use that with your framework for when you're talking about evil and suffering. If something doesn't have that sense of what it is to be that thing, then is it suffering? And then because it is or is not suffering, is that evil?
Right. Is the rubber tire suffering when it's burning?
Right.
Now it's doing harm. The gas, it's doing harm to the environment, but is it in itself experiencing pain? Right. So that would be one of the angles, I think.
Or like when I put hand sanitizer on my hands, I've essentially killed millions and millions of microbes. Is it evil? I mean, I've killed many, many things in just one fell swoop.
That's
a single pump.
That's interesting. Yeah. And if you just do this, I mean, all the little micro organisms permeating all around us. To take a step, in a sense, is to commit some kind of I wouldn't say, kind of the next point, I guess, killing, right? Talking about life. It has like all these qualities, right? It can reproduce. Mm-hmm. It must metabolize.
It's going to try to maintain
mobile.
Homeostasis. Mobility isn't necessarily a quality of life, because you will have things that, that they are perfectly content staying in one spot.
Right, that's true. But so when someone cuts down a tree, right? Now there have been things I think very interesting that in these massive tree networks, right? Some trees will have more nourishment than others if they directly came from, I guess, the parent. And so that suggests, is that instinctive, or is that conscious? Different level of consciousness, right? Because it originally had that thought about consciousness and abstracts, and you helped me kind of course correct and what I think about levels and ranges of being able to identify what is a being, right? And there's the self and the we, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, if you cut, I think I got a little off track, but not in a good way.
I mean, because like when we have the trees,
mm-hmm.
and I think we can still correlate that to we know we've identified a living thing here, because it's generally accepted trees are alive. I mean, though the center part of the tree, the xylem, is going to be, it's dead, and so the living part of the tree is essentially a thin band around the edge. But I think that sort of ties into the same sort of thing. So it's not my hands anymore. It's not taking a step. Now we're killing trees.
Right.
Do we draw the line there? I mean,
Right. Or, when it comes down to, so I'm trying to try to string some things together here to make kind of a question,
Okay.
kind of in a way. Now, I myself am moving, trying towards a kind of, vegetarian kind of way, but I've eaten, meat products all my life, other dead, non-human animals, and most of society has. But so if we take killing as to survive, I wonder if the context matters. I wonder if intentionality matters, right? Because, for instance, humanist groups and humanitarian philanthropic organizations and so on, I would wager to say, not every single person is, is a vegetarian. Highly doubtful of that.
right.
Be very surprised if that were the case. Yet, we're doing all these things to try to improve life around the world in some capacity. There's humanitarian groups that are trying. They run animal shelters. They run orphan centers. They hospitals and so on, Doctors Without Borders, and so on and so on. We're trying to do good, and there's still the issue of being heterotrophs. And, there's that key vitamin, isn't it, that it's more harder to come by, that you can't get from plants. I forget what it was. B something.
B12?
B12. Right.
Right. You can, me personally, I vitamin supplements that you get.
Okay.
My vitamin I take every day has 250% my vitamin B12 intake. So
It's compensating.
right. So it's really not too big of an issue. I think it's just whenever the idea gets brought up, and this goes back to cultural norms, I think. So it's culturally acceptable, at least here, that you have that hamburger, you have the steak. That's part of right. So to come to someone who accepts it as a norm and tell them, well, that's not something you should be doing, it's actually bad. I don't think that necessarily crosses over. It's not part of the enculturation as they grow up.
Right, that's a really good point, the enculturation, because you have enculturation and then you have acculturation, right? The example I like to use is the Russian fur traders when they were coming back in the 1700s in the Aleutian Peninsula in Alaska, right? They just, main swift, basically, as I understand, started trying to, those who would comply, everyone to Eastern Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy. And as I understand, destroyed a lot of what was very unique about the way of life. And went about the way. And now I've left behind this kind of very stirred up, dramatic shift in culture. And I would consider that acculturation, where you would have enculturation, just people being people, going other places and adapting to whatever the norms become over time. And growing up with it, becoming normal.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think a good distinction, is that Joe, was on the show, and makes a really good reminder that you can be a kind of humanitarian. The word itself, right, the connotations, but the way I mean it is trying to act in ways which reduce harm and bring people together and increase available resources and in general reduce suffering possible. And you have different religious groups that are also humanitarian. Now, granted, there's some problems there if they're going exactly by what their book says, but the people themselves are what's doing it, right? And they're just kind of interpreting however they need to interpret it, or just ignoring however they need to ignore in order to, achieve their goals.
Right. And for some reason, this actually makes me think of a specific case, and I know we've touched on this one before. So in the particular case of Mother Teresa.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in that specific situation, suffering was not seen as a bad thing. So
Right.
like we're talking about suffering in a negative sense every time we mention it, and I think that's typically the case. Most people would agree, but in this unique instance, it's not. It's quite the opposite.
She really elevated, and people get upset when you mention it, right? How can you speak ill of, Saint Teresa? She is officially saint as of, so whatever. It has two miraculous deeds, witnessed, verified, however they have it, right?
Right.
She's canonically now, I guess, saint according to the Catholic canon, but Agnes, whatever her name was, right? Yeah, it's interesting because suffering was kind of aggrandized, that, well, the house of the dying, you go there and you don't have medication, you don't have any of that, you just somewhere to die. And I'm thinking, why not take them somewhere to live and improve? Readily available medicine if they just had it.
Right.
And but the argument comes, I hear people will say that well, everything is ephemeral. All that matters is your faith, because this stuff doesn't matter. There's a lot of things wrong with that. You can't. We don't know if there is anything after, and there are a lot of philosophical problems if there were. What it would entail, what it might entail, especially with what we see empirically throughout the world now. A lot of problems there to suggest that.
Right. And kind of the idea that nothing really matters except for your faith. Well, that doesn't really do future generations much justice, I don't think. So you're not necessarily planning ahead. You're not thinking about impacts on the environment. You're not thinking about setting things up to where they're going to have sort of a better life. So it is an odd thing to hear that all that matters is faith. So
and it's highlighted. Now, granted, I understand some people will use it as a virtue, right? That faith is, my faith is strong. I think they misuse the word. I think they're betraying themselves in that way. Maybe they're using it how they mean to use it, but I think they're trying to attach a force to it. Like your faith level is over 9,000, right? So therefore, you must be, everything's fine. It's like a power level, right? Your faith level, is 1,000,000. There's nothing that can, nothing can steer me off course.
That's the ones that believe they can move mountains. I think that's how it goes.
Or call down fire from the skies, as one of the disciples, I believe.
Right.
And the thing is, I was in a conversation with someone elsewhere, and they said that their brother was going to a trip somewhere in the Middle East that apparently, I forget the name of it, but that it's apparently on the government's list of do not travel to zones or something like that. Very, very dangerous. And they're doing some kind of mission trip or something. And so she went on the boards and she was asking people for some support. Help me get through to him, kind of thing. And a lot of people had thoughts, of course. And long story short, I got into a conversation with someone, and they said their sincere faith basically informs them that they know they're correct about these things and they're not worried. And I was thinking, well, sincere faith can lead you to believe anything. So
Right.
Is that the best method, to quote Matt Dillahunty, is that the best, well, not just him, but many people, but he uses it a lot, thankfully. Is that the best method to determine whether something is true or not? Because faith in a more colloquial sense as well, could be registered as thinking something without any good reason to think it is so.
Right.
Now, people might be, that's not what it is. It's the relationship with God or whatever. Okay. But it goes back to that earlier part of indoctrination, of being to build up the, how you think about things, and build up this kind of God is always with you, and a lot of unfalsifiable claims that they just become part of your regular vocabulary. And next thing you know, you're saying them without even really thinking about it, and you're now producing your own Kool-Aid and drinking it. It might be crass, but I think that's, and it's completely detracting away from what it is we do every day. You ask someone, do you have enough faith that your chair will hold you up? Well, yeah, sure. Why? Oh, well, it was constructed of good quality steel and yada, yada, yada. And you deconstruct it back down, and it's all just about empirically followed methods to derive quality and stability when I'm not falling over right now. It has nothing to do with faith. It's the opposite.
Right. And I feel like there's a sort of a gray area between how it's defined, how it's used, and then other terms that get kind of put in its place, like reasonable confidence or expectation that the chair is going to hold you, or maybe belief. I don't know if that's a good word to replace with it either, but it's like if I use faith, it's sort of as, I believe something with insufficient evidence, or perhaps once upon a time I might have said, I have faith that the earth is flat. And I mean, that could be true. I could absolutely believe that. I would be wrong, but it could be a belief that I hold. So to prove that point, it's not necessarily the best way to go about figuring out something.
Right. One of the things which came to mind with faith as well is that, and this is actually something that Doubter 5, it goes by his name, talks about in his book. And it was Atheism, What's It All About, or something like that. And he put the big faith and the little faith, right? We have functional trust in systems that we verify and test and are constantly reliable. That's your little faith, maybe. That will we get to town on time? Will their car explode in mid-transit? No, I doubt that's going to happen because of so many reasons. Then you have the big faith, which is just you believe something, you can't really defend it in the same way you can defend the smaller faith. So it's the leap of faith kind of thing to what, this only makes sense because of this, or this is what I've been told and this is what feels right, and the scripture tells me this, and so on and so on. People use it in all kinds of ways. But yeah, the line between reasonable confidence in something versus I'm going to believe something for which I willfully ignore contradictory evidence, or I simply have no reason to believe otherwise. And it's just compartmentalized, I think. A lot of the times. We don't think about it. We don't let it stop us from going about our day avoiding existential crisis. So what does faith really mean?
Right.
We just compartmentalize it.
Right, and even especially concerning, if I want to talk about faith, and I want to talk about how it relates to evil. So,
sorry.
No. It's part of building the idea, I think. So, given specific examples, like I think one that people like to talk about a lot is the story of the man who nearly sacrifices his son. His name escapes me.
He had Elijah? It was the son. Abraham? Was it? No. I'm confusing them biblical names too.
Right. It's a big book. There's a lot of people. So if I were looking at this sort of scenario, and it was from a guy, modern day, he goes up to a mountain, and he has decided he's going to sacrifice his son. And right before he does, he slips and falls, and something happens, and he takes it as a sign. I would still be tempted to call that bad. I mean, I'd go as far to say evil. I mean, I don't see how you can take the story and be like, well, it's not evil, because in the biblical story, his faith is what's guided him to do this, and through his faith, he knows that God's will is never evil.
Right. It just can't happen.
Right.
It's not considered a possibility.
Right. Or examples where they go to a land where they've decided that land is theirs. They were promised it, so they should go in and kill everyone. It's not evil, because God told them to do it. I mean, I think in a more modern sense, we would look at that and it's like, well, they killed a whole lot of people. That's pretty bad.
Yeah, we look at that in modern days and say that you've just infractured national sovereignty.
Right, but if they said, well, we were told by God that it was okay, I don't think we would accept that. I don't think anyone would accept that.
Right, and that's the example. To put, and this is why I'm sure similar situation with friends or families and so on. And I think this is one of the nail, bite, the clawing, gnawing, internally consistent frustrations. At least personally, I think it's not just myself. The questions that we could ask to be more effective, right? I think we sometimes stray from. I know I do, because I don't want to hear the answer from the the people I'm talking to, because how they answer that might really, really affect me and psychologically, and even asking them might really, really affect them psychologically, detrimentally. So what I'm getting to is, say you were to ask a family member, a close family member, put yourself in the. I didn't want to say it was Elijah, but yeah, it's frustrating.
I know it's going to bug you now.
It is. I'll look it up. But basically, ask them to swap places with those people, and then ask them, would you do it? You're not sure. You might have an implication, but just in asking the question, can you see the harm that might come, the psychological harm, just from asking a question, which is in a book.
Yeah,
it's in a book. It's in their book, but you're asking them to swap places, right? But from empathy, we know perhaps maybe there's a time and a place to ask that. Maybe there's a way it could be framed, because we're worried about how it could be taken. I'm not in every single case, any question, right? There's, if you did that, you couldn't ask any questions, or a lot of questions.
right.
But such a raw question, you might not want to hear the answer. I mean, even if what they say you think they're just speaking out of fear, but to hear a close friend or family member say those words can be quite emotionally damaging.
Right, I think someone with enough faith would say, for sure, they would be in that situation. They know the outcome. They know the end of the story, so they're not too worried. But then you could interject. I'm going to butcher his name, Jephthah.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. Yeah, that's
the one who he's in a conflict, and he prays that God helps him win it. He'll sacrifice the first thing that comes out of his house. It turns out it's his daughter.
Rather convenient storytelling, but yeah.
Right. I mean, so in this sort of scenario, there is a last minute, saved by whatever happens. This actually goes through. He actually sacrifices his daughter in the story.
And it's explained away sometimes by saying, well, no, he didn't do it. Well, no, he did. She was given a month to mourn and grieve the life that she'd never have, and then he had to go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
So it happened.
Right. So if you put him in that story, in that scenario,
Good point.
then there's no last minute. There's no I know the end of the story and it turns out okay. This is just a generally all around sort of bad thing.
Yeah, and some other good questions, or that same kind of framing comes to mind. A way to think about it, because if you were sitting at home, this message appeared before you, and it told you to go out and do some violent act against your neighbor, right? Depending on who you propose that situation, you might ask a host of things. How do I know this? Who did this come from? Am I affected by some, something like a mind affecting something? Am I awake? Who is this? That's a pretty evil thing to do. It seems like. Who would tell me that? Was that God? Was that Krishna? Was that any of the other thousands of religious characters?
I wonder how you would handle that sort of situation before you know what the brain is and does. If I heard voices, I would be able to say, I should probably go talk to a neurologist. They could probably tell me what's going on. But let's rewind the clock 2,000 years, 3,000 years, and then I'm hearing voices again. Well, surely to goodness, some magical thing is talking to me. So,
right. And I have it has to do with so I have some experience in that.
Okay.
But that's
perfect.
Yeah. But it's a long struggle, I think, of either whether it happens or whether it's a hypothetical scenario. The question itself, if the command is go out and do this thing, well, is it euthyphro, right? Is it good because it's commanded by the thing, or is it good because it is good to do so and the thing commanded it? Well, in that case, I think they're both bad. But if you subscribe to moral command, to divine command theory, and you're convinced it was coming from Yahweh, then it'd have to be good by definition. Mm-hmm. But then it's flipped around to ask, well, wait a minute, are you even sure that it is the Yahweh or Zeus or anything else? Maybe it's an evil force. I mean, maybe you should ignore it.
Right.
And but
then how do you tell?
How do you tell exactly? How do you tell? And people would say you would just know. Memory is fickle. It's not as reliable as people would want. Witness testimony is not as reliable as you would want. One of the things Neil deGrasse Tyson goes on about, right, is that the furtherance of science is, basically concordant with our ability to remove ourselves from our biases and observations.
Right.
And if anything, enhance them when they're necessary, so we can get more objective results and find that indeed the Earth is, as best we can tell, 4.5 billion years old, and indeed the universe is roughly 13.7 billion years old, and those don't come through faith. They come from doing hard science over hundreds of years, thousands of years. I say, if you go back to the Greeks, and even back then they knew the Earth wasn't flat. There's the sun and there's the well and spread out and everything.
Right.
I've been rambling a whole long, and I was going to say it's getting down to the last 5 minutes or so, and just want to mention really quick, there's the Skeptics Book Club. That's on the second Sunday of this month. The book's a million. Third Sunday, again, we have RAT meeting from 10:30 to 12:30, and then we have a reflections meeting at the end of the month. We should know more about that later. But normally I have a script ahead of us, and there's something to read from, but it's just kind of frazzled. But so any thoughts you might have about about the question that I've been really bad about dodging around and getting spun away from.
So I mean, with evil, I mean, you gotta first you have to decide what it is. I mean, it's going to be different from person to person. We've already figured that out.
Right.
Then you have to look at, what influences are coming from my culture? What influences are coming from my sense of empathy, which we can draw back biologically through evolution. So I don't think there's a one solid answer for where this sort of thing that we're calling evil comes from. It's kind of built up from this framework of different aspects. So
Yeah, and it's such a good point that it depends on, you know, what you're aware of. It's your perspective. I think it's round. I think it can be rooted in empathy and awareness of other people, and but from then isn't that kind of the basis of a lot of understanding anything else? I mean, you know, on a neurological level, right? We'd have all these nodes and synapses firing, and you eventually have the emergent property of consciousness. My layman's attempt at it.
Right.
And then from there, through sufficient consciousness and awareness of other things, you'd have a sense of understanding and awareness of other things, which would bleed into empathy. So it seems like our core reality can be reduced, at least not to the atomic level, but on our thinking level could be reduced to being aware that we live in a space shared by other entities also capable of perceiving other things outside themselves, most likely. I can't prove, you know, I don't know if you're a robot.
Right. I mean, that's a certain, I want to say it's the condition where you have a psychopath who feels no sort of sense of empathy, and then they're able to commit certain crimes without feeling anything towards the people because they can't objectively, I guess it would be to put yourself in that sort of subjective mindset of the victim in the case. So it's not a universal trait. It is another thing. And how does he view this, what we've been talking about, this sort of sense of evil?
Yeah, I mean, it seems most people would agree that slavery, in the asymmetrical sense, right, not a contract, whatever, but asymmetrical slavery would be wrong, as would perhaps beating up on and taking advantage of, again, asymmetrical situations. Children, you know, bringing suffering to them in all kinds of forms. You know, they haven't lived, they don't know how to make judgments yet.
Right.
You know, causing unnecessary harm just because. All right. So again, kind of going off the top of my mind. Okay, so getting to the less than a minute left. The Atheist Society Knoxville and the Rationalist Tennessee meet spread throughout the week. There's some comments, right? You know, times in there. And we're on here every Wednesday from 6:30 to 7:30. CTV Knox. So CTVKNOX.org. And something. Oh yeah, and free thinkers. Everyone, you know, not confined to religious. You're not alone.
Not alone.